In this fourth and final video in my series about cults, I'll just try to sort of draw some conclusions and maybe recommendations. I began aware that for many people, cults are absolutely evil, negative. And for example, you have the picture of a sort of a cold psychopathic person creating a cult in the way that the Nazi Party seems to have been formed, manipulating people and using every sort of image and uniform and that and propaganda to spread this cultic message. On the other hand, when I described in great detail about the Church of Chaos and the sort of techniques I used, including this thing of stirring up the crowd, you're getting them standing up and shouting, sort of unifying them. Now, I could sound like a sort of coldly calculating psychopath doing that, but actually, it wasn't like that on the day. Basically, I was a rather shy person, frightened about what I was taking on, and just thinking, what do I have to do now? What's the next thing? And that was really what inspired it, rather than me being really calculating. But I can look back and see that actually it was, a very. I was using people by doing that. I was manipulating. And I showed two cults which clearly offered something. The Buddha field, to start with, offered a real sort of feeling of joy and aliveness and enjoyment of life and community. And the process, although apparently much more sort of sinister in that, gave people a real sense that they were doing something meaningful. They weren't just, as I say, just sitting back watching TV. They were sort of doing something. Now, another aspect which I just briefly referred to was the extent to which a cult, rather than just being totally controlled by a manipulative person, can actually control the person who's creating it. Kumari found that out, that he definitely was starting by just thinking, what do I do to make a cult? He was being manipulative like that. But he found he began to get sort of, to some extent, sucked into it. He began to experience some of the things that he thought he just invented. And similarly, I felt that very much, both with Sri Baba Rebop and particularly with Dr. Evil Be My Good, was that I was being carried away on something, and it was a bit of a struggle to get back afterwards, to detach myself from it. One of the things that happens, you see, is that this thing of you begin to experience miracles. Now, of course, an outsider can always say they're just coincidence, things like that. But in the closeness of the process, they began to find real telepathy and miraculous things happening, like that fish that washed up, perfectly edible, when they were starving. And of course, the rationalist tendency is to fall back on the most primitive survival mechanism of the mammal brain, or the animal brain, even pre-mammalian, which is to see the world as just made of solid objects, and actions cause and effect, rather than experiencing, the meaning of things, the synchronicities, the way everything is connected, which the higher brain functions can perceive. And so, just as the Catholic will do the sign of the cross to banish something weird and evil, the skeptic does the equivalent thing in words, coincidence, and it's gone. You don't have to bother about it. All these things could be explained away, but the cults seem to get the mindset where you begin to operate at this higher level, where you see these connections and things, and you see the fact that mysterious magical things do happen. So I would say that rather than feeling that I, as Sri Baba Rebop, was making miracles happen, it felt to me more like I was allowing people to see the miracles that do happen. Now that brings me to a point which I touched on quite briefly, is the idea of an egregore. The idea and when I gave my talk about egregores on one of these videos, I pointed out there's sort of two versions which actually overlap. One is the egregore where a person or group of people get together to create this thought form, to build it up, and it becomes an egregore. The other idea is that their egregores are out there already. And so what you're really doing is sort of invoking an egregore and then shaping it, bringing it down like a blueprint. And so, in a sense, anyone forming a cult of any type is bringing down the blueprint of the great cult egregore. And then they're shaping their own particular cult, but it has the power of that basic egregore which is out there. And that sort of explains to me the way the cult can gain momentum and can even take over the person who thinks he's just building a cult. It gets into that mindset is very infectious. And interesting on the thing of egregores, you see, I used to think that because my mother was Scottish, my father was Anglo-Saxon, that my mother was of Celtic background. Actually, I discovered when I did my DNA test that my mother's line came down from Scandinavia as Vikings and settled in the far western Isles of Scotland, where apparently they became senior people in the We Free Church movement, which is a very strict sort of Protestant movement. And I remember my mother describing someone who I think would probably my great-grandfather or something. And he said he had this great big beard and these blazing eyes, and he would get up onto the pulpit, glare in silence at the audience of this congregation. Then he'd shake his fist and say, "You're all damned." And she said the congregation was thrilled. So, sort of, the egregore of the hellfire preacher was perhaps somewhere in my blood, and I just, it felt like the very opposite of me, but it came out. Anyway, the idea of egregores, you see, I think really casts some light on the idea of cults. But on the other hand, I can really understand why someone should be so threatened and should hate cults so much if a close family member has been lost to a cult. Someone who you were so close to not only goes away and is sort of locked away from you, but actually changes in a way that they no longer want to come back to the family. Now that is pretty threatening. So I thought I would create a sort of cult experience like that, taking some of the most extreme things that cults do. The first thing is they tend to prey on people who are at a low point. They're drifting, they're perhaps feeling depressed, they don't know what they're doing. So let's imagine a young man of about 20, and he's been educated, but he can't get work. The job market is lousy. He's beginning to feel really unwanted and useless, feeling a bit suicidal. And then he joins this thing. Now, the first thing is it cuts him off from his family. Not completely in this case, but, he's taken away and only can see them in a very limited times places. And in fact, he's behind a high-walled enclosure with electric wires and barbed wire and everything, which only the worst cults do that. Even Buddhafield and the process, you were never actually locked in. It's just you became locked in by the magnetism of the cult. But let's say that he suffers that. And let's say he's broken down in this cult by things like sleep deprivation. His individuality is crushed. He has to shave his hair off, and dress in a sort of cult uniform. He can't wear his own clothes, things like that. Everything done to dehumanize him and turn him into a machine. Now, one of the sort of, to me, the worst things at cult we saw in the wonderful thing about the Rajneesh people, the Wild Wild Country, where such was the paranoia that people who'd probably joined for the sort of the bliss, the love, the friendship, the humanity of the movement, found they were being weapons trained to fight off the enemy. Now let's say this happens too. This young man is forced to do that. I could understand members of the family being really horrified and detesting that cult. But actually, of course, what I've just described is a young man joining the army. Now, people say, but that's different. It's not a cult. Well, everything it does to people is things that cults do. But the point is that most people understand the army. They know what it's all about. Whereas some weird cult coming from the Far East or something, they don't understand it. It just seems crazy. But I wanted to focus, you see, not so much on what it was, the army rather than a cult, but what it does to the people. And everything that was done to that young man is the sort of thing you get from a cult. And in fact, it's done in a particularly brutal way. This dehumanizing. If you're a rich person joining the army, you'll be tormented. Hey, rich boy, you've got to clean out the urinals using your own toothbrush. If you're intelligent, okay, brain box, you won't be allowed to talk for the next 24 hours or something. All these sort of things actually attacking the very things that you identify with. And I remember a friend of mine joined the RAF when he was still at that sort of very new, rather desperately wanting to do the right thing, feeling a bit self-conscious. He was dragged out of bed in the middle of the night with bright lights in his eyes and said, sort of, name a four-letter word ending in K meaning intercourse. And he said, fuck. And he was punished for that. He couldn't go back to sleep. He was punished. And the next day he had to speak over the camp loudspeaker so everyone could hear. He said, and he gave his name and rank. I'm just a dirty-minded little tyke. Because, of course, the answer he was supposed to give was not fuck, but talk, T-A-L-K. Now, I say that was sort of quite amusing in retrospect. But I know another person who took the thing of polishing your boots, which was a great army thing in the 50s and 60s. And he took it to such an extreme, I'm going to have to break. There was a phone call. Where was I? Oh, yes, that's it. This guy was passionate about polishing his boots, and so he had one pair that he would use on exercise, and the other pair, which was just for parade, and he'd polish them. He'd spent days, weeks, polishing to a mirror finish. And the sergeant major came down the line in an inspection, looked him up and down, and said, "These boots are absolutely disgusting." And he crashed his heel down on the boots and ground it. So all the layering of wax and everything cracked and broke away, and the leather was left torn, that sort of thing. And then he was told he had to come back after supper and properly dressed and show that he knew how to shine his boots properly. That really hit him where it hurt most. And that's the sort of thing that happens in the army as you're broken down and reshaped, which is just what a cult does in many cases. I don't think it's only men that suffer that, because there's a very interesting book called Through the Narrow Gate by Karen Armstrong, who became a nun in, I think it was in the 60s, and went through very similar sort of humiliating experiences. She really was sort of ground down and reshaped. And a particularly interesting thing that I found in that book was that eventually, although she went really far with the nuns' training, she eventually decided it wasn't for her, and so she left and joined ordinary life. And she found it was really difficult to adjust. Again, another side of the cult thing, that you get so into this closed world that it's very hard to go back to what we call reality. So, with these examples of, cults, and then things which we don't call cults, we understand, but actually are really doing the same thing, Another thing is we also use the word cult in ways which are relatively inoffensive. A cult movie. Now, something like, I know, Star Trek, there are people who go to conventions and dress up and use the language and everything, and that really is very cult-like. It is a sort of cult. But it's not one which has got those locked doors. Uh, Although even then, I could imagine perhaps one little in a small town, one group of Trekkies who are so close to each other that if one of them says, "I'm giving this up," I think it's rather childish. He might actually be sort of cast out. It's possible because it is natural cultic behaviour to do that. Um, I in the early 90s, when I was a bit disappointed that my books weren't selling very well or being taken up by proper publishers, and accepted by uh, literary agents. I realized that I was a cult author. And the thing about a cult author is, firstly, that not many people buy my books, otherwise it wouldn't really be much of a cult. The other thing is that I'm very much unknown. And I realized that made a special relationship between me and my readers. Because if you find someone whose books you really like, and that person is relatively unknown, you sort of own that author. He's yours. He isn't other people's author. And so I realized as a cult author, I had a very special relationship with my readers, which was precious in its own way. Right, so what I'm saying with these examples is that we can't just say cults are out there, there's something utterly bizarre that doesn't belong in our society. It's actually sort of our society's deeply steeped in this sort of cultishness. And I think that because it has its roots way back in the evolution and survival of mammals and humans. And I talked about this in one of my videos about the way we've evolved from the very primitive animal idea of an objective reality, or rather, no, of a material reality, where things are solid objects and there's no meaning or connection. They don't have minds, things like that. The most primitive idea, which is a very easy user interface, which offers great survival value. You can depend on things happening. It's only as the brain evolves you get the more subtle things of the magical thing of consciousness being everywhere. The artistic sense of beauty and aesthetics, and then the religious feeling of higher meanings and all that. These come as the brain evolves. Now, one of the most important of those evolutions is the sense of the social sense, the pack animal sense that binds people together. Because if you think of a single wild dog, it's quite a humble creature. It would probably have to live off rabbits and rats and nothing much more. But a pack of wild dogs is one of the most formidable predators in the savannah. It can take down huge animals. It's by being a pack, they become very powerful. And that pack animal thing is very strong in humans. The fact that humans can give their life in support of some abstract idea or a nation or a political theory or a flag, to give your life for something like that is very weird, really. And yet it's this very powerful pack instinct we have. And so, and which of course leads to religion and the sense, you see, I wonder whether a pack of dogs, it obviously understands or acts as if it knows this sort of, they're part of a group. But I don't suppose it has that sense that when they're all dead, the pack will continue in another generation. And that sort of extends the abstraction into more like a religious idea. But anyway, it's very strong in humans. And to me, this is very much the power which drives this cult behavior, even when people are trying to deny it. What is so threatening to the pack is the individual. Um, in a war between nations, the person who starts to question whether our nation really is right or whether it's just as criminal as the enemy, very dangerous. In a religion, the person who begins to question the scripture and say, this doesn't quite make sense, dangerous. These people are thrown out. They're exiled. They're heretics. People are very suspicious of the loner. Whenever there's one of these sort of mass shootouts or school killings, afterwards people say, he was a real loner, you know. As though being a loner is a sort of instantly makes you into a psychopathic killer. There's a real fear of being outsider, the loner. And of course, being a magician is the epitome of that in many ways. I've already argued that it isn't so much what you do as the direction you're facing in that distinguishes religion and magic. In two ways. One is that the direction of religion is taking us from this everyday world up into spirit, whereas the direction of magic is more typically bringing spirit down into matter, creating talismans, power objects, invoking into the circle. But the other thing is other direction is that religion is towards the group, whereas magic is towards the individual, the search for your own true will. And so you can have a magical ritual, which is a group one, very powerful, and has a wonderful group effect, and is very valid for that. But I say the real magical value of that is what the individual takes out of it. Does it help him to find his true will? Does it work for him? That is really the magical value of it. And so you could see why in a pack it is very important to try to destroy that individuality and rebuild yourself as a member of the pack. Now, therefore, they can be very critical and scornful of the magical way of looking inside yourself, introversion. They can say it's navel gazing, it's selfishness, it's narcissism, things like that. And the media, who are like a pack of dogs, wild dogs, they will launch into attack of people who do that. Well, I also explained in one of my videos when I was talking about what I discovered in the Abramelin operation was I was in a process where I was removing labels, or rather I should say I was detaching from labels that society had given me, the pack had given me. It's almost as though, you know, you've got a Hells Angels leather jacket covered with badges. One of those badges says, I'm British. Another says, I'm educated. Another says, I'm in my 70s. All these badges, and some people, well, most people sort of really identify with some of those badges. I'm an educated British septuagenarian. You know, that's what I am. And they will defend that. And if anyone sort of says, oh, these bloody educated British septuagenarians, they'll feel quite offended because it's hurting them. Now, you see, what I was doing, if you realize you could detach from all those. Yes, I am British. I can't get away from that. But I'm living in South Africa for several years, and if I got South African citizenship, would I stop being me? No. You're getting back, layer by layer, badge by badge, to finding your true will, what is underneath all that. And actually, it's a lifetime journey. You never complete it. But what I did find is I was getting closer and closer to a common humanity. So the irony of that is, by turning your back on the crowd and going inside yourself, you actually find your way back to being a member of the whole. Whereas a lot of those badges are used to break people into sub-packs. You know, you're educated, so you wouldn't understand the man in the street, that sort of thing. You know, creating these splits. Whereas if you don't identify with that label, you're spared that sort of battle. You know, you're above it. You can look at how things really are rather than feeling you're in a class war or something like that. So I think this is a very important thing I'm uncovering here. The difference between carried away in the pack, which can be a wonderful experience, and finding and following your own true will, which is another type of wonderful experience. And again, I say I wasn't necessarily being calculating and planning, but I can see now the importance of what I did in the Church of Chaos. When I described that I'd got people into this absolute frenzy of pandemonium, and then I told them to go back to their seats and calm down. And it wasn't like, okay, switch off now. It was, I realized the air was buzzing, and I said, it's buzzing, it's buzzing. These bees of chaos are buzzing all around. The air is full of them. As you sit there, they're buzzing around you, that sort of thing. And then I said, these bees are swarming. They're settling. And each of you has this swarm of chaos bees buzzing inside you and everything. And then they're coalescing down to a chaosphere. And the thing I kept saying at the end, I went on and on until they were really quiet, is, that is your chaos. No, it is not your chaos. It is everyone's chaos. But it is your chaos. No, it isn't. It's everyone's. I kept this paradox. It's your chaos, but it isn't. It's everyone's chaos. And I kept that until they were fully quiet, and I ended up with the Aum. Now, what I was addressing was this, that you can have a wonderful group experience. It might be a New Age workshop, discover your inner what's it or something like that. You have this great experience, or a wonderful church service, or watching a football match or something. And when it's over, or having a nice holiday in a beautiful place, when it's over, do you go back sad that you're returning to the drabness of ordinary life, and you wish you could stay there? You wish you could be living in the south of France rather than coming back to wet old England? Or do you come back feeling refreshed and stronger, knowing that there are these alternatives that you can go to from time to time? And I think that's a very important difference. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. My own feeling about cults, yes, obviously certain things I don't like about them. But I think in a way the most insidious cult thing in our society is the celebrity cult, the cult of celebrity. And I've talked about this where, you are in the audience, a vast audience filling a whole stadium, and there's this godlike figure up on the stage. And you are almost literally worshipping that person, even if it's a singer or a politician speaking rather than an actual guru talking spiritual things. But you're worshipping this person. You're a fan. And what I try to point out is that it's possible to feel so inferior, like a nobody. You look around at this huge audience. You're just like a drop in the ocean. You're nothing. And there's this shining person up there. And so people want to be celebrities. They'll do anything. They'll do stupid things to become celebrities, as if that was what life was all about. And so I try to point out that actually, if you think about that person up there, say he's a pop singer, the reason he's up there and is shining is because you have put him up there. It's the audience have given their power to that person, just as the chaos magicians gave their power to Sri Baba Rebop, and he rewarded them with an experience as a result. And they did it to the chaos priest. So I think that is a very insidious thing in our society, because it's accepted, and it leads to what I call the bestseller effect. Where a book which happens to sell a lot of copies, maybe just because they spent a lot on the advertising, or it's got a gimmick of some sort, because it sold a lot of copies, It's put on top of the bestseller list. And so when you go to a bookshop, a whole window will be full of it. And when you go in, there is a great rack, bestsellers, and there's the book. And if you're in a hurry, you just buy it thinking, well, it can't be that bad. And you got it. And I think to me, that seems so ridiculous. Why do you bother to be the bestseller? If it's a bestseller non-fiction book, it's got an idea in it which everyone will be talking about soon. You'll be able to read reviews of it. You'll hear it discussed on the radio and blogs and things like that. You can't get away from it, So there's no need to buy the book or read it. You just get it secondhand, and better because you'll get people discussing it to and against. So you actually get a better feeling of what it's all about if you don't buy it. Now, fiction books are a bit different because actually it's a sort of experience, a journey that it's offering. But again, if it's that much of a bestseller, within a few months you'll have friends who've got a copy that can lend you. And by half a year later, the second-hand bookshops will be full of copies you can pick up for a song. So I was thinking, why the hell do people go for bestsellers? I walk past them all and I go to the shelves with interesting, obscure things like the stuff I write, totally different. Anyway, that's a bit of an indulgence. What I wanted to get back to was, let's say after all the things I've said, someone is still left with the idea of the total evilness of cults, and they must be stamped out. How would you create a movement to get the word through society and get these things banned and illegal and everything? And I can think of someone who did something rather like that. It was about 10 years ago, Richard Dawkins. He had written books about the stupidity of religion and how they delude people and make them do crazy things and lead to wars and all that. He talked on television and talks on the follies of magical thinking, and all this mock occultism and divination, and how it's all a sham, and people shouldn't be deluded by it. He really was sort of driving this idea that, he even said some of these things should be banned, So there was a very powerful force to eliminate everything we've been talking about in cults. Now, at that time, I went to his website and I discovered that with all the material in there, he had a shop and it was selling merchandise. It was selling vestments, T-shirts with slogans on them like religion, together we can find a cure, rationalist slogans on T-shirts. And he was also selling jewellery. He had a little sort of curly A thing, which you could get them made out of silver to hang around your neck, or you get them as brooches or perhaps earrings, I don't know, but in all these different forms. And what he was suggesting was exactly the same as the Christians did at the beginning of the 1990s decade of evangelism. They created this little sort of fish symbol, and they said, if you wear this badge or have it on your car, people will ask what it is, and you can start a conversation and proselytize them. And that's exactly what Dawkins was suggesting. If people ask what is this little curly A, you can tell them about skepticism and rationalism, and so you can win them over. So basically, he was using the methods of cult to beat the cult. In fact, he created this thing called the Foundation for Reason and Science. And its structure was very much like the sort of Scientology or process sort of pyramid where you had to sacrifice more and more as you just get close to the center, the sacred center. Apparently for $85 a month, you got discounts on the T-shirts, the jewelry, and also you had a chance to meet one of the key figures in this cult, as it were, the high priests of this cult. But if you paid $210 a month, which is about $5,000 a year, um, uh, you would be able to attend an event where he spoke, and you have a chance to actually to meet him. Wow! And then, as you went through these two more expensive circles, um, if you were prepared to pay $100,000 a year or more, you could have a private breakfast or lunch with Richard Dawkins. You could sit at the feet of the Guru himself. And a reserved table at an invitation-only circle event with him, as well as, of course, still having cheap T-shirts and things like that. And the website suggested that the donations of up to $500,000 a year will be accepted for the privilege of eating with him once a year and becoming a member of something called the Innermost Magic of Reality Circle. You see, it looks like the only way to beat a cult is to create a better cult. In fact, the people in that cult, I had friends who would, on Sunday, they would have a regular thing where they would take over a church and they would hold a sort of secular service, with singing secular hymns and having a rationalist sermon and perhaps readings from books and things like that. He just sort of recreated religion. Yes, so that's so really to finish with. What I would want to do is to go back to that first question I addressed when I looked at the rather wonderful Buddha field experience, and I said, "This looks so good. This happy, laughing people on the beach, things like that. What are the signs? What do you look for that tell you that this could end up badly?" And people will say things like, "Well, the man was a narcissist," or his spirituality was trite, and things like that. But I was looking for something rather more fundamental, a real danger sign, because this varies from cult to cult. And I decided that it's that thing of, if this cult suddenly stopped, if, for example, the police swooped in, arrested the guru, and closed the thing down, or, perhaps more likely, if my family got in with the cult busters, and they came and kidnapped me and took me away and deprogrammed me back in my ordinary life, the life I'd tried to escape. The question is, would I be stronger or weaker if that happened? And you see, if you take a drug and you have a wonderful experience, but you then can't live without the drug, you're an addict. And I suggested that the people in that group, many of them became addicts. They couldn't live without the guru. On the other hand, I once took psilocybin. It was a time in my life where my life was so grey and drab that I couldn't take a holiday. You see, I might go away and have a few days, a wonderful place, but I'd come back. Well, first of all, when I was out there, I couldn't fully enjoy it because I'd be thinking, oh God, in 48 hours, I'll be back at the office desk again. Oh shit. I wasn't really enjoying it because of just the knowing the hell I was going back to. Of course, when I got back, I'd be thinking, I wish I was there. I wish I was on the south of France again. But actually, with the psilocybin, what happened is I had my first real holiday for ages in one day. And I would take it again in the right circumstances. It was a wonderful thing. But I didn't have to, because I'd got so much from that realization that I can take a holiday, my mind can do it, that it was so valuable that it strengthened me for my return to ordinary life. This, I think, is a very important test. If you think of people who leave the army, now I know some of them, if it's a war time, do arrive with real serious handicaps. And I'm not so much talking about that as the people who are demobbed from the army and they find they can't adjust back to ordinary life. they become alcoholic or druggy or depressed. And you hear a lot of this. In fact, there are people who especially try to deprogram people and get them back to ordinary life after they've been in the army. It's a challenge. But when I think about it, in one way it's rather absurd. Someone who's been in the army comes back into real life, he ought to be a Superman because he's been kept very fit doing the exercise. He's fitter than probably the other people, the civilians around him. He's learnt survival techniques. He's faced dangers that would keep people up at night just thinking about them, but he's survived. He's faced them and he's survived them. He's been toughened up. He's been taught to live off nothing. This person ought to be a Superman, and yet many of them come back and just can't adjust. And so that's what I'm looking for as my test of a cult. If you are having a wonderful time, it may be very tough, it may be very hard, but you really feel you're doing something worthwhile, or you are enjoying life and being more alive than all the people around you, the grey people out there, just ask this question. If it was suddenly stopped and you were forced back into that grey life, would you go back richer? For the Buddhi field, you left it because you found people who were so much more, you joined it because you found people who are so much more alive. You discovered your joy in that movement. You discovered your sociability, the way you could interact with people. Now, if you went back to the old grey life, could you take the sense of your own joy with you? The sense that you can, that you have other levels of being and things like that. Could you take it back to enrich that grey life and improve it? Because that's really what I was trying to do in my cult experiences when I look back on it. I was trying to present them with something which would be a great cult experience, but would actually leave them gifted with something that they could carry back into the real world and live it better. And in fact, like yeast, leaven it with what they had got from the cult experience. As the thing I quoted from the ex-Processian was, we made a lot of mistakes, but it was one hell of a ride.